Usually when a society embarks on like a massive structural shift, I mean, something on the scale of completely rewiring a national energy grid or redefining these huge international alliances, there is this inherent expectation of solid engineering.
Yeah. You assume they have a plan.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You assume the architects have actually looked at the blueprints,
Mm-hmm.
like they've calculated the load-bearing walls, they've done the stress tests, and they know exactly how the foundation's going to hold up.
Which is supposed to be a methodical process.
Right. It's supposed to be methodical. But when you examine the reality of modern European politics right now, particularly this collision between green energy ambitions and a rapidly destabilizing global landscape, you realize the architects aren't just missing the blueprints.
They're building on quicksand.
They really are. They're trying to build this green utopia on a cracking foundation, all while willfully ignoring that the neighborhood is, well, quite literally catching fire.
And, that realization is exactly what is keeping analysts and policymakers up at night right now.
Oh, absolutely.
It is this sudden, really chilling awareness that the protective bubble Europe operated inside for the last, 30 years?
Yeah, since the 90s.
Right, that bubble has popped. And the foundational assumptions governing their entire economy, they're just no longer valid.
And that panic, that specific realization, is exactly what we are dissecting today. So welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you're here with us.
Yeah, we've got some fascinating material to get into.
We really do. Today's mission is pulling insights from a recent, highly charged panel discussion on the Dutch political talk show called De New Wereld, which translates to The New World.
And they had a really heavy-hitting panel for this one.
They did. They brought together energy expert Remco de Boer and several prominent political commentators to unpack a deeply uncomfortable question. Basically, they're asking, is Europe stumbling blindly into a compounding energy and geopolitical crisis that could rival or, even surpass the economic shockwaves of COVID-19?
Which is a terrifying premise, honestly.
It is. We are looking at the intersection of political paralysis, the deeply hidden structural costs of the energy transition, and this massive loss of global leverage.
But before we go any further, I think it is critical we lay down some parameters for this analysis.
Good point. Let's set the ground rules.
Because the source material from this Dutch panel captures a very raw, unfiltered moment of intense anxiety. And because of that, it contains some highly politically charged commentary.
Yeah, it gets pretty heated.
Right. The panelists express very specific, very forceful views regarding figures like Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and international organizations like the UNRWA.
So let me be absolutely crystal clear on that point for you, our listener. We are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing or validating any of the specific political viewpoints or characterizations made by the panelists. Our role today is strictly analytical.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. We are impartially unpacking the logic, the fears, and the arguments presented in our source material to help you understand the intense debates currently paralyzing European policy circles. We are looking at the mechanics of their arguments, not judging the ideology behind them.
And, the underlying mechanism driving all of these arguments is a profound loss of certainty.
How so?
Well, for decades, Europe's economic model was predicated on three external pillars.
Okay.
First, heavily relying on cheap energy from Russia. Second, depending on cheap outsourced manufacturing from places like China. And third, trusting in an unquestioned security umbrella provided by the United States.
Right, the post-Cold War consensus.
Exactly. And what this panel reflects is the harsh, really inflationary reality that those three pillars are either currently crumbling or they are already gone.
Wow.
The era of outsourcing your heavy lifting is over, and the continent finds itself severely underprepared to handle its own weight.
So let's look at the domestic machinery tasked with handling that weight. Because, local political paralysis wouldn't be totally fatal if Europe still lived under the protective bubble of the 1990s.
Right, you could afford some mistakes back then.
Exactly. But without that geopolitical leverage, domestic incompetence becomes incredibly dangerous. So the panel begins by zeroing in on the current Dutch government, which is operating as a minority cabinet.
Which is a nightmare to manage.
It really is. For anyone accustomed to, like, a two-party system or a sweeping parliamentary majority, the sheer mathematical fragility of this setup is stunning. The source describes a parliament that is massively, just paralyzingly fragmented.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
Let me break it down to help you visualize this. The Dutch lower house has 150 seats total. The largest single progressive bloc holds a mere 24 seats.
24 out of
Yeah,
150.
right. And behind them, you have a cluster of about 5 different parties hovering around 20 seats each. And then a fractured right wing with factions like J21 holding 15 seats, Forum for Democracy with 12, alongside just a dozen other micro-parties.
And we really need to dissect what a minority government actually means mechanically here because it completely changes the physics of political power.
Break that down for us.
Okay, so in a standard majority system, governing is essentially an exercise in party discipline. If the prime minister wants to pass a sweeping national budget or, fundamentally alter environmental regulations, they simply whip their own coalition members into line and the legislation passes.
The power is just automatic.
Right, exactly. The power is automatic. But in a minority system, you possess zero automatic power.
None at all.
None. Every single piece of legislation requires a bespoke, temporary coalition. You basically have to go into the parliamentary bazaar and shop for votes on an issue-by-issue basis.
It's like operating a minority government under those conditions is less like owning a house and more like being a day trader buying on margin.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You don't actually own the votes, right?
Right.
You are borrowing them at an incredibly high interest rate, and your only collateral is your reputation. And the second the market or the public or your temporary allies loses faith in your word, you get a margin call and your entire government collapses.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the concept of political capital. Trust and reliability are literally the only currencies that matter, which is why the panel spends so much time agonizing over the unforced errors being made by the current cabinet.
The unforced errors.
Right. Yeah. They highlight a recent, highly damaging gaffe by the housing minister, Mona Keizer. Now, housing in the Netherlands isn't just a secondary issue.
Oh, no, it's huge.
It is an acute, generation-defining crisis. You've got massive shortages. You have nitrogen emission restrictions actually halting new construction and soaring prices.
And according to the source, the minister placed on this incredibly heavy dossier is viewed as an absolute amateur. The panel actually notes she was placed there out of the blue.
Which is never a good sign.
No. So what does she do to manage this delicate, high-stakes portfolio? She gives an interview not to the Dutch press, not to her own parliament, but to the British newspaper, The Guardian.
Of all places.
Right. And in this foreign interview, she casually floats the idea that the Dutch public might soon need to use shower coins to ration their hot water usage.
And to understand the visceral backlash this caused, we have to look at the mechanics of the policies she proposed.
Yeah, explain the shower coin thing, because that sounds crazy.
Right, so shower coin isn't a metaphor. It refers to an actual physical or digital rationing system, which is often used in campgrounds. You receive a hard limit of, say, 5 minutes of hot water before the system physically shuts the water off.
Wow.
So proposing that as a national housing standard implies a severe, unprecedented regression in baseline living standards for a modern Western European nation.
So the public reaction was understandably explosive. I mean, why are you flowing draconian hot water rationing to a British newspaper before you even have the courage to debate it in your own parliament?
It's political suicide.
It really is.
Yeah.
When you are day trading on margin, taking an unvetted, highly restrictive domestic policy and beta testing it in foreign media, instantly liquidates your political capital.
Especially when the panel notes that during actual parliamentary debates, this same minister frequently admits to not fully grasping the material.
Wait, really?
Yeah, she constantly requires civil servants to whisper instructions to her during debates.
Oh, that's a terrible look.
It's awful. You have a fragile minority cabinet that desperately needs to project this aura of unflappable competence just to prevent a vote of no confidence. So publicly demonstrating amateurism on the housing dossier destroys the foundational trust required to govern.
But the amateurism of the rookie minister is one thing. Where this deep dive gets genuinely fascinating is when the source highlights a scandal involving an experienced, seasoned politician.
Ah, Minister Schurzma.
Yes, Minister Schurzma. This is where the mechanics of backroom deal-making completely unraveled. So Schurzma was tasked with passing a budget for development cooperation.
Right.
But because he's in a minority, he didn't have the votes. He needed support from the right-wing factions.
And those factions extracted a very specific price for their votes.
They always do.
They demanded that the Netherlands pause all funding to UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinians.
Right. And following intelligence investigations, including those heavily promoted by Israel that accused certain UNRWA staff members of having ties to Hamas, the right-wing parties made cutting this funding their absolute red line.
Exactly.
So Jared engages in the horse trading. He agrees to their terms, explicitly promising not to support the resumption of UNRWA funding.
You shakes on it.
It does. The right-wing parties hold up their end, they supply the votes, and his budget passes. He gets exactly what he needed. And then, I couldn't believe this part mere days later, Sheriksma releases a formal letter announcing that actually he will be resuming the UNRWA funding in the autumn.
Yeah, it was a maneuver that instantly infuriated the right, who obviously felt completely defrauded.
I mean, wouldn't you?
Right. While simultaneously, it alienated the left-wing parties who were just utterly baffled by the erratic zigzagging of the policy itself.
I have to push back on the panel's interpretation of this, though. Let's unpack this for a second. The source material features an expert who attributes this flip-flop to what they call old reflexes.
Yes, the old reflexes theory.
Right. The theory is that Sheriksma spent years in the previous Mark Rutte administrations, which were majority cabinets, and he basically just forgot how minority politics work.
That he mentally hasn't made the shift.
Exactly. That he still operates under the delusion that he can force things through without consequence. But honestly, that feels entirely too generous to me.
You think it was deliberate?
I mean, isn't it far more likely that in a fragile week-to-week minority government, this kind of rapid-fire flip-flopping isn't a psychological lapse, but a highly cynical, intentional survival tactic? Like trying to buy a house with a bounced check. You lie to the right on Tuesday to get the budget passed, and you pivot back to the left on Friday to appease your own base, hoping the resulting outrage doesn't formally materialize into a no-confidence vote.
It's a really fair challenge to the source's premise. The counter-argument the panel would likely make, though, is that if it were a calculated, cynical strategy, it was an incredibly mathematically flawed one.
Why is that?
Because of the nature of minority rule. Syriza will need those exact same right-wing votes again next month for a totally different piece of legislation.
Oh, right. He burned the bridge.
Completely. By burning his credibility on a relatively minor financial dossier, the source actually notes the UNRWA funding in question was around 17 to 18 million euros.
Which is a rounding error in a national budget.
Exactly. He effectively committed political suicide for his future legislative agenda over a rounding error.
He margin called himself.
He did, and whether it was a cynical calculation that backfired or genuine institutional inertia, those old reflexes of a political elite used to absolute power the outcome is exactly the same.
Yeah.
The panel views this as a systemic failure of leadership. The political class in Europe has not mentally adapted to their newly weakened reality. They're still operating as if they have structural supremacy, both domestically against their own parliaments and internationally against the rest of the world.
And this almighty fantasy that they control the board is precisely what brings us to the global stage.
This is where it gets scary.
It really does, because fumbling a domestic housing portfolio or alienating a local voting bloc is damaging, sure. But attempting to bluff your way through a burning geopolitical landscape using those same exhausted tactics, that is catastrophic. The panel characterizes the current global situation as an absolute tinderbox.
The anxiety in the source material regarding international actors is just palpable.
Yeah, they don't hold back.
They point to leaders like Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, explicitly characterizing them in the discussion as arsonists who are deliberately setting the region ablaze. They cite aggressive rhetoric, referencing alleged threats from Trump to, quote, bomb Iran into the Stone Age. But regardless of one's political affiliation, the core anxiety the panel is expressing is the deep unpredictability of the current world order and how severely exposed Europe is to that volatility.
And the source makes a brilliant analytical distinction here that I think completely reframes how we look at European policy. They draw a hard line between an ambition and a strategy.
It is arguably the most crucial framework of the entire discussion.
Tell me about it.
Well, an ambition is simply a desire for a preferred end state. It's just a goal.
Okay.
And Europe's political discourse is entirely saturated with ambitions. They want to completely decarbonize their economy. They want to enforce universal human rights. They want to dictate the terms of peace agreements in the Middle East. They want to immediately sever reliance on Russian gas. And they want to eradicate the use of coal.
Which, to be fair, are noble ambitions.
They are.
Yeah.
But wanting to go to a zero-carbon utopia is just picking the destination. A strategy is calculating how many millions of tons of copper you physically have to mine, smelt, and lay into the ground to build the grid to actually get there.
That takes actual planning.
A strategy requires an honest, often brutal accounting of reality. It requires anticipating the countermoves of hostile actors, understanding the hard mathematical limits of your own natural resources, and glaringly facing your own supply chain vulnerabilities.
Precisely. And the panel's thesis is that Europe currently operates almost entirely on ambition, completely devoid of strategy.
Yeah.
One commentator on the show likens this to an infant-like almighty fantasy.
I love that phrase.
It's so descriptive. It's this incredibly naive, deeply ingrained psychological belief within Western political structures that they can simply snap their fingers and mold the world to their moral preferences.
Right.
They actually believe they can simultaneously shut down domestic fossil fuel production, sanction major energy exporters, and transition to a perfectly green grid without ever experiencing rolling blackouts, inflation, or geopolitical blowback.
And the psychological concept the panel references is fascinating. They compare it to a child's magical thinking during a divorce.
Oh, the divorce analogy. Here's where it gets really interesting. Explain that.
So the child genuinely believes, if I just organize my room perfectly, and if I just behave flawlessly, I have the power to make my parents get back together.
Right, trying to control the uncontrollable.
Exactly. It's an illusion of control over a system that is fundamentally out of their hands. It forces you to wonder if the West is in a state of collective systemic denial about its actual geopolitical leverage.
Are we just printing policy papers to pretend we still run the world?
The panel emphatically suggests that yes, we are in deep denial. And to illustrate the terrifying gap between green ambition and hard geopolitical strategy, the expert on the panel points directly to the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, let's look at the actual geography and economics of that, because the mechanics are vital here. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow choke point between the Persian Gulfs and the Gulf of Oman.
It's incredibly narrow.
We are talking about a waterway where approximately 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption and over 20% of the global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, physically passes through.
Right. So if you are a European politician operating purely on ambition, you write a policy paper stating, we will transition to wind and solar by 2035. Therefore, the Middle East's oil dynamics no longer dictate our security.
Problem solved, right?
Except reality doesn't care about your policy paper. The strategic reality is that Iran holds immense leverage over that strait. If a regional conflict escalates and that strait is mined or blockaded, or if the Houthi rebels further militarize the Red Sea and completely sever the Suez Canal shipping routes, which, by the way, they are already actively disrupting,
Right.
Europe's future green ambitions evaporate instantly. You cannot run a continent on the promise of wind turbines that won't be built for a decade when your existing grid and transport networks are starved of fuel today.
The resulting energy shock would be immediate and crippling. You can't legislate your way out of a closed shipping lane.
You really can't.
And this lack of strategic realism brings us to the very center of the source materials critique, the energy transition itself. How did the push for green energy inadvertently weaken the continent? The panel argues that the obsessive push for a cleaner, greener continent has, ironically, become the exact mechanism dismantling Europe's economic security.
But it is essential to clarify Remco de Boer's position here. The source is not arguing against the necessity of transitioning away from fossil fuel.
Right, they aren't climate deniers.
No one on the panel is advocating for a return to cities chased with smog or denying the realities of carbon emissions. The objective of moving toward renewable energy is universally accepted by them as valid.
Yeah.
The devastating critique is leveled entirely at the execution. The specific, uncoordinated manner in which European governments have forced this transition has generated massive, entirely predictable negative externalities.
And the primary symptom of this botched execution is what the Dutch call net congestie, or severe grid congestion.
This is a huge issue.
To really grasp why this is happening, we have to look at the physics of how the power grid was originally constructed. For a century, European grids were designed around centralized baseload power.
Right.
You had massive coal, gas, or nuclear plants reliably pumping out a steady, controllable stream of alternating current, or AC power, distributing it outward to cities and factories.
Yeah.
It was predictable. You knew exactly how much power you had, and you can dial it up or down based on demand.
But the mandated transition fundamentally broke that physical architecture.
How so?
Well, wind and solar power are highly decentralized and inherently intermittent.
Right. The wind doesn't always blow.
Exactly. And the sun doesn't shine at night. Furthermore, solar panels produce direct current, or DC, which requires massive inverters to convert to the AC power the grid actually uses.
Oh, I hadn't thought about the AC-DC conversion part.
Yeah, it's a huge bottleneck. When governments heavily subsidize the rapid installation of millions of solar panels and thousands of wind turbines without simultaneously upgrading the physical cables, transformers, and substations required to handle multi-directional, unpredictable power flows, they created a massive physical bottleneck.
It's like they bought a fleet of high-speed trains without bothering to lay down the new tracks.
That is exactly what they did.
And now, the grid is completely maxed out. You have businesses in the Netherlands that literally cannot get a connection to the power grid to expand their operations. They're just told, no, we're full.
It's incredible.
But the panel makes an even more damning point about the supposed success of Europe's climate policies. Because, European politicians frequently stand on the global stage and boast about this massive triumph. A 37% reduction in domestic greenhouse gas emissions since 1990.
And look, on a spreadsheet, a 37% reduction looks like an unparalleled victory for the green agenda.
It sounds amazing.
It does. But the panel relentlessly pulls back the curtain on the mechanics of that statistic. How did Europe actually achieve that drop? Did they suddenly invent perfectly clean, zero-emission blast furnaces for steel?
I'm guessing no.
Did they discover a magical way to synthesize fertilizer without natural gas?
Definitely not.
No, they didn't eliminate the carbon, they just gave it a passport. The source points out that a massive portion of that 37% reduction was achieved by systematically dismantling heavy, dirty industries, smelting, chemical processing, heavy manufacturing, and exporting them directly to Asia.
Wow. So what does this all mean? It sounds like we decided to clean our house by sweeping all the dirt into our neighbor's yard, and now we're bragging about how spotless our floors are.
That's precisely what happened. The global demand for steel, aluminum, and consumer plastics didn't vanish. The physical manufacturing didn't stop. Europe simply outsourced the smokestacks to countries with lax environmental regulations, ensuring the emissions no longer counted on European domestic scorecards.
It's the ultimate geographical accounting trick.
Yeah.
I mean, European citizens feel incredibly self-righteous driving their pristine, silent electric vehicles through the historic streets of Amsterdam. But the steel chassis of that car, the incredibly energy-intensive mining and refining of the lithium for the battery, the heavy chemical manufacturing for the interior plastics, all of that is taking place in industrial zones in China.
Often powered by newly constructed coal plants.
Right. If the emissions are just happening elsewhere, are we actually helping the climate or just our own egos?
It's mostly egos at this point. Meanwhile, the source notes that global emissions have risen by 65% since that exact same 1990 baseline.
Wait, 65% up globally?
Globally, yes. We aren't cooling the planet, we are just laundering our carbon footprint.
And the strategic danger here is what really stood out to me. Because by pushing out industry, Europe loses its capacity to innovate and scale new technologies.
This is a crucial point that often gets lost in the policy debates.
Politicians act as if innovation is purely an intellectual exercise. They think as long as they have prestigious universities and tech startups writing code, they will lead the green revolution. But you cannot code a wind turbine into existence.
You really can't.
You cannot software update a next-generation nuclear reactor. Innovation requires a massive industrial base. You need the heavy manufacturing facilities to build the prototypes, test the physical material tolerances, and actually scale the production of solar panels and battery storage systems.
And the panel brings up a chilling historical parallel to illustrate the danger of this deindustrialization.
What's that?
The initial weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, the mask shortage.
Exactly. When the global supply chains froze, Europe discovered to its absolute horror that it had outsourced so much of its basic manufacturing capacity that it could no longer domestically produce simple, low-tech paper face masks.
Or basic pharmaceutical precursors.
Right. They were utterly paralyzed, effectively reduced to begging China for essential medical supplies. And the expert in the source material warns that if Europe continues to hollow out its heavy industry in the pursuit of ideological green purity, they will face the exact same paralysis during the next major military or energy crisis.
That is terrifying.
You cannot build a resilient, sovereign energy grid if you no longer possess the blast furnaces required to forge the steel for the transmission towers.
So if exporting our emissions weakened our industry, how is the current pace of the transition affecting our global competitiveness? This perfectly tees up Remco de Boer's most illuminating analogy.
Oh, the Peloton analogy.
Yes. He compares Europe's strategy to a lone cyclist in a massive race. Explain the peloton concept.
So in aerodynamics, the peloton is the main pack of riders in a cycling race. There is a massive efficiency advantage to staying inside the peloton. You draft behind the others, conserving your energy. But de Boer describes Europe as a cyclist who has decided to aggressively sprint out far ahead of the pack, determined to cross the net zero by 2050 finish line first, entirely alone, taking the full brunt of the wind resistance.
And the sheer hubris of that sprint becomes apparent when you look at the math.
The math is brutal.
The panel cites a staggering statistic.
Yeah.
The entire European Union is responsible for only 5.9% of global emissions.
Just 5.9%.
I had to read that twice. The massive heavyweight engines of global emissions, China, the United States, India, they make up the rest of the peloton. And they're absolutely not playing by Europe's self-imposed, exhausting rules.
And the discussion surrounding China's strategy is particularly revealing here.
Yeah, let's talk about China.
Because China is undeniably investing hundreds of billions into renewable energy. They install more solar panels and wind turbines annually than the rest of the world combined. But, and this is the critical distinction the panel emphasizes, they are not doing this to achieve ideological purity. They are doing it as part of a ruthless, pragmatic, all-of-the-above energy strategy.
All of the above.
Yes. While they build solar farms, they are simultaneously constructing dozens of new nuclear reactors, aggressively securing long-term liquefied natural gas contracts, and, most importantly, building massive new coal-fired power plants.
Wow. So they aren't shutting down reliable, dispatchable power just to look virtuous?
Not at all.
They understand that baseload energy is the lifeblood of industrial supremacy. They are hoarding every single megawatt of power they can generate to fuel their economic expansion.
And the warning from the source is stark and mathematically unavoidable. While the European cyclist exhausts itself financially, structurally, and industrially by paying astronomical energy premiums to be the fastest to decarbonize, the Chinese peloton, fueled by cheap, abundant, reliable energy, is simply going to draft behind them.
Just biding their time.
Exactly. They will let Europe pay the early adopter premium for green tech, conserve their own economic energy, and eventually completely overtake the exhausted, deindustrialized European cyclist.
And nowhere is this self-destructive, exhausting sprint more vividly illustrated than in the panel's discussion of the Groningen gas fields.
Oh, this part was unbelievable.
This segment of the source material was genuinely staggering when you dig into the engineering and the geology of what they actually did. For context, the Groningen gas field in the northern Netherlands is one of the largest natural gas reserves in the entire world.
Huge reserves.
But extracting that gas caused severe, highly damaging earthquakes that terrorized the local residents for years.
And to understand the policy response, we really must understand the geology here.
Okay, give us the geology lesson.
Natural gas in Groningen is trapped in the microscopic pores of a vast, deep layer of sandstone. As the gas is extracted, the pressure inside those pores drops significantly. The immense weight of the Reich layers above begins to compress the now depressurized sandstone. This subsidence causes the overlying rock layers to shift and drop, releasing massive amounts of seismic energy along ancient fault lines.
The earthquakes.
Yes. The resulting earthquakes caused billions of euros in structural damage to homes and deeply traumatized the population.
So it was a profound failure of government oversight. And the political consensus rightfully demanded that the extraction be halted.
Right, everyone agreed on that.
But halting extraction is one thing. What the Dutch government ultimately chose to do crosses the line from public safety into what the panel calls incredibly dangerous symbolic politics.
Yeah, they didn't just turn off the valves.
No. They made the decision to permanently seal 70 out of the over 300 extraction wells. And when we say seal, we're talking about a permanent, irreversible engineering process.
Yes, the process of plug and abandonment. They didn't just close a pipeline. They pumped thousands of tons of specialized solid concrete deep into the well bores, deliberately destroying the integrity of the casing and permanently cementing the geological formations shut.
It's permanent.
From an engineering standpoint, it is designed to be economically and physically impossible to ever extract gas from those specific wells again.
The panel expresses absolute disbelief at the strategic blindness of this decision.
Yeah.
I mean, why on earth would you permanently, physically destroy your own life raft just to prove to the rest of the passengers that you are committed to swimming?
It makes no strategic sense.
The host presses the expert on this, asking about a drill baby drill mental shift.
But they are very careful to nuance this. They are not advocating for a reckless return to unchecked 19th century fossil fuel consumption. They are advocating for a realistic embrace of all necessary energy sources to maintain baseline national security. You need vast arrays of renewables, yes. You need next-generation nuclear power. But you also absolutely need to retain your domestic gas and coal infrastructure.
Because true systemic resilience requires keeping strategic reserves on standby for worst-case scenarios.
Exactly.
If you deliberately concrete over your own massive domestic gas reserves to satisfy a political ambition, what exactly is your strategic backup plan for the inevitable week in January when a high-pressure weather system stalls over Europe, the wind completely dies, and snow covers the solar panels?
And the source points out the profound hypocrisy and absurdity of Europe's current backup plan.
Oh, this is the best part.
They are physically cementing over the Groningen gas fields, while simultaneously drafting frantic plans to import fossil fuels from incredibly unstable regions.
Like where?
They are looking to import oil from Nigeria, a nation actively grappling with severe internal instability and terrorist insurgencies like Boko Haram.
Unbelievable.
Or they are crossing their fingers, hoping that Qatar and the United States will always have the political will, the surplus capacity, and the secure shipping lanes to send massive tankers of liquefied natural gas across the ocean.
It is the ultimate manifestation of magical thinking. You are aggressively outsourcing your fundamental survival to volatile, unpredictable foreign actors simply because you refuse to get your own hands dirty managing your domestic resources.
It really is.
And this insistence on ideological purity, while covertly relying on massive energy consumption, perfectly sets up the panel's pivot to the most glaring contradiction in the government's green agenda.
The data centers.
Yes, the explosive growth of hyperscale data centers and AI.
This is where the tension between Europe's competing ambitions physically breaks the grid. The panel directs blistering criticism at what they describe as a neoliberal let-it-be policy approach that actively encouraged these massive tech behemoths to flood into the Netherlands.
I mean, we just spent 20 minutes detailing how the electrical grid is suffering from acute net congestion. We have local bakeries and manufacturing plants that are being told by the utility companies they cannot expand because there's literally no remaining capacity on the local transformers.
Right.
Yet the government is greenlighting the construction of hyperscale data centers that consume the baseload electrical equivalent of entire mid-sized cities.
The contradiction is staggering. Politicians desperately want Europe to be the digital hub of the future. They want to attract multinational tech companies, they want to dominate the rollout of artificial intelligence, and they want the prestige of the digital economy.
Who doesn't?
Sure, but you cannot host the infrastructure of the AI revolution on a fragile, overburdened, intermittent energy grid. AI server farms are absolute energy vampires.
They really are.
They do not operate on the natural rhythms of the sun or the wind. They require constant, massive, unbroken streams of baseload power for complex algorithmic computing and equally massive amounts of power and water just to keep the server racks from physically melting down.
I want to bring in a concept here that I think perfectly explains what the panel is getting at. The Jevons paradox.
Oh, good connection.
Yeah, it's an economic principle that states that as technological progress increases the efficiency with which a resource is used, the overall rate of consumption of that resource actually rises rather than falls.
Yes.
We thought digitizing our world would save energy. No more paper, no more physical commutes. But the extreme efficiency of AI algorithms has actually created an exponentially larger demand for raw computing power. We aren't saving energy. We are devouring it at a pace the grid was never designed to handle.
And the host of the Dutch panel shares a brilliant, incredibly relatable anecdote to highlight the hypocrisy of the average citizen who complains about this paradox.
The dinner party story.
Yes. He describes attending a dinner party where the entire table is passionately, angrily complaining about these massive, ugly data centers ruining the Dutch landscape and draining the public energy grid.
Right.
But as they're delivering these righteous monologues, sitting right next to their wine glasses are one, sometimes two, smartphones.
Of course.
Devices that are actively pinging servers, streaming background data, processing location algorithms entirely reliant on the continuous operation of those exact same data centers they claim to despise.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like complaining about traffic while sitting alone in a giant SUV.
Exactly.
But it forces a terrifying, highly practical, logistical question. If push comes to shove and the grid maxes out, who gets the power?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Let's say Europe hits a freezing, windless winter week and the physical limits of the copper wires are reached. Does the grid operator route the remaining electricity to keep the heat pumps running for citizens in their homes? Or do they route it to the hyperscale AI servers processing algorithms for a multinational tech conglomerate?
And that zero-sum dilemma is the exact question the political class is desperately avoiding. The expert on the panel uses this scenario to hammer home the central thesis of the entire analysis. Not everything is possible at the same time.
You have to choose.
Yes. The laws of physics dictate that you cannot simultaneously have cemented over gas fields, a moratorium on new nuclear power, a fully intermittent green grid, zero carbon emissions, and remain the global baseload hub for AI computing. The math simply fails.
But because politicians refuse to formulate a strategy, because making a choice means admitting failure on at least one of their grand ambitions, they simply kick the can down the road.
They just ignore it.
And when physical reality eventually forces that choice upon them, the resulting grid shutdowns and economic rationing will be completely chaotic because they were never planned for.
Which brings us to the ultimate consequence of this compounding failure. So when the grid is congested, global supply chains are threatened, and politicians refuse to make hard choices, who ultimately pays the price?
The source is unequivocal. The devastating financial impact will land squarely on the shoulders of the ordinary consumer.
The ordinary man and woman.
The panel's projections for the near-term economic shock are genuinely staggering. They discuss the trajectory of basic fuel, warning that gas prices at the pump are rising so rapidly they could realistically head toward 3 or even 4 euros per liter.
Which is astronomical.
Right. For our listeners operating in gallons, that is an apocalyptic, economy-halting price for fuel.
And we need to understand the physics of inflation when energy prices spike to that degree.
It's not just commuting costs.
No, it isn't just about the personal cost of commuting to an office. Energy is the foundational input for absolutely everything in the modern economy. If diesel hits those prices, the cost of every single item delivered by a truck skyrockets.
Everything.
The cost of natural gas dictates the price of nitrogen fertilizer, which dictates the cost of every piece of food in the grocery store. The panel specifically warns that the economies of Southern Europe, which are highly reliant on transport and already carry heavy debt loads, could be completely destabilized by this systemic inflation.
So faced with this impending shock, how do governments respond? The expert outlines 2 violently opposing economic philosophies currently warring in the halls of European parlance.
Right.
The first is the cold, pure mathematical view. They operate on the principle that the best remedy for high prices is high prices.
In macroeconomic terms, this is known as demand destruction.
Demand destruction.
It is a brutal self-correcting mechanism. If fuel goes to 4 euros a liter, working-class people simply stop driving. Energy-intensive factories shut their doors, permanently laying off workers because they can no longer afford to operate. The overall societal demand for energy violently plummets, and eventually, the market stabilizes at a lower price point.
So it works on paper.
It works mathematically, yes, but humanely, it requires mass unemployment and widespread poverty.
Which is why, politically, allowing pure demand destruction to happen is electoral suicide. No prime minister can survive presiding over the deliberate impoverishment of the middle class.
They'd be voted out instantly.
Exactly. So you have the second camp of political interventionists. They argue the government must step in to shield the consumer. They propose artificial price caps on electricity, massive state-funded energy subsidies, or emergency relief checks.
But the panel rightly points out the fatal flaw in that strategy.
What's the flaw?
Well, if you artificially cap prices and subsidize the cost of energy, you are just printing money to hide the disease by treating the symptom.
Right.
You keep demand artificially high when supply is restricted, which requires the government to borrow billions of euros, thereby driving up systemic inflation even further. You end up destroying the purchasing power of the currency itself.
So if we cap prices, are we just hiding the disease? But if we let prices skyrocket, aren't we inviting total societal collapse and yellow vest-style protests?
It is a terrifying lose-lose scenario born entirely out of a lack of long-term strategy. If you intervene, you bankrupt the state. If you let prices skyrocket, you invite total societal collapse.
And we have seen the immediate physical manifestations of energy price spikes in Europe.
Oh, absolutely.
The massive, violently disruptive yellow vest protests in France, convoys of tractors blockading national highways in Germany, and the Netherlands' absolute social unrest.
And the panel points to real-world sectors that are already beginning to fracture under this pressure.
Like what?
Take the travel and aviation industry, which is deeply interwoven with Europe's massive tourism economy.
Oh, true.
This sector could be fundamentally devastated by soaring kerosene prices. Remco de Boer himself, a leading energy expert, notes during the panel that he now exclusively takes the train instead of his car.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and he has explicitly put his European flights, quote, on hold. He views the impending costs and the unreliability of the system as too great a hurdle.
When the energy experts are quietly grounding their own flights and parking their cars because they can read the mathematical writing on the wall, the general public is in for a profoundly rude awakening.
They really are.
We are looking down the barrel of a future where frictionless global mobility, the defining hallmark of the modern European lifestyle, reverts to being an exclusive luxury for the ultra-wealthy.
And the overarching conclusion the expert draws from this cascading series of failures is that Europe is hurtling toward an unavoidable, deeply painful reality check.
The golden era is ending.
The golden era that defined the late 20th and early 21st centuries, an era defined by cheap, abundant, reliable energy, an endless flow of inexpensive consumer goods manufactured in Asia, and frictionless global mobility. That era is definitively ending. And the tragedy, according to the panel, is that it isn't ending purely because of bad luck or historical accident. It is ending because the geopolitical systems that supported it are fracturing, and European policymakers actively, deliberately dismantled their own strategic shock absorbers in pursuit of an almighty fantasy.
You know, it fundamentally changes how you view that original gaffe by the housing minister, the infamous shower coins.
Oh, man, yeah. Bring it back to the shower coins.
When we first mentioned it at the top of our deep dive, it was easy to laugh it off as the clumsy political amateurism of a rookie minister who accidentally said the quiet part out loud to a British journalist.
Right, a PR blunder.
But when you place it in the context of everything we have just spent the last hour unpacking, the permanently cemented gas wells, the hyperscale AI data centers draining the grid, the myth of the 37% emissions drop built on outsourced industrialization, and the total reliance on fragile supply chains through contested waterways. Maybe the shower coin wasn't just a PR mistake.
It is entirely possible it was an accidental glimpse of the actual blueprint.
Yeah.
The shower coin is the physical manifestation of demand destruction at the household level. When the underlying grid can no longer physically support the grand political ambition, localized rationing is the only mathematical outcome left available to the state.
We've covered an immense, deeply complex terrain today. We started by dissecting the fragile, week-to-week survival mechanics of a fragmented minority Dutch cabinet politicians trapped in institutional inertia, burning their precious political capital on backroom flip-flops while utterly failing to grasp the vulnerability of their own system.
We really went through it all.
We traced how that exact same lack of strategic realism has infected Europe's broader approach to the globe. We saw how an uncompromising, idealistically driven energy transition, combined with the cynical outsourcing of both emissions and heavy industry to Asia, has left the continent terrifyingly exposed to a geopolitical tinderbox it can no longer control.
And we broke down the aerodynamics of the global peloton. Watching Europe exhaust its industrial base by sprinting toward net zero alone, while competitors like China ruthlessly deploy all of the above energy strategies.
Okay.
And we examine how the persistent refusal to make hard foundational choices, refusing to choose between heating citizens' homes and powering AI data centers, or between ideological purity and maintaining strategic gas reserves, is setting the stage for a massive inflationary economic shock that will ultimately crush the ordinary consumer.
I want to invite you, as you finish listening to this, to look closely at the environment around you. Look at the smartphone on your desk, the electric vehicle in the driveway, the rapid delivery cardboard boxes on your porch. Are the green conveniences around you truly sustainable, or are they built on a fragile foundation of outsourced pollution and naive geopolitical assumptions?
Which leaves us with a final vital question to build upon the anxieties expressed by the New World panel.
Let's hear it.
We have spent the last 30 years optimizing our Western economies for maximum efficiency, maximum digital integration, and absolute environmental purity within our own borders. We demanded pristine air, high-tech lifestyles, and a clean conscience.
We wanted it all.
We did. But if the true unavoidable cost of basic survival and sovereignty in a newly fractured global order requires embracing a pragmatic, all of the above energy strategy, if true resilience means we must physically reopen domestic mines, keep aging coal plants on active standby, and aggressively bring heavy, carbon intensive manufacturing back onto our own shores, it means accepting that our immediate environment will inevitably become a bit dirtier and significantly more localized.
So the question is, are we, as a society, culturally, politically, and psychologically prepared to accept a highly visible, painful step backward in our domestic climate ambitions today, simply to ensure that we retain the industrial capacity to survive the geopolitical crises of the next decade?
It is a monumental question. And judging by the panel's analysis, it is one the current political class is terrified to even whisper out loud.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking past the simple headlines. Keep demanding to see the engineering blueprints of the policies you are told are inevitable. And keep questioning the narratives driving our world. Until next time.